Today on the John Ankerberg Show, why does God allow evil and suffering in the world? If you've ever sat by the bedside of a loved one and watched them die from some terrible disease, or you've lived through an earthquake, a hurricane, or a tornado, then you've probably asked, how could God let this happen? Isn't He supposed to be all-loving and all-powerful? How can there be any good purpose behind all of this? And if there is, what is it? To help us understand the biblical and philosophical answers regarding evil, my guest today is Dr. Norman Geisler, philosopher, theologian, and president of Southern Evangelical Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina. Dr. Geisler is the author of more than 50 books and is considered by many to be the greatest living Christian apologist. As Americans think back on the events of 9/11, many still ask, why did God allow such horrible suffering and death to happen to thousands of innocent people? We invite you to hear this important topic that touches every one of us. Welcome. We're talking about the problem of evil. This is a problem that faces all of us. As we come up on the anniversary of September 11th, can't help but think of people that went to work in the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. They never realized that at the end of the day, they'd be jumping out of skyscrapers, they would be crushed, they'd be burned, planes would fall on them. And you say, how in the world could God, if He's all-loving, all-powerful, how could He let something that terrible happen? Well, it did happen. And to help us put a handle on it, to try to come up with answers from a biblical perspective about a God who is all-loving, who is all-powerful, and does know everything, what's going on? We call this the problem of evil. And our guest is Dr. Norman Geisler, president of Southern Evangelical Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina. Norm, I'm glad that you're here. Frame the problem of evil. What is it that we as Christians we're facing? What do we have to contemplate when we look at evil in the world?
Well, the first thing is we have to decide whether or not it's real. And there are three basic views. The pantheist says God exists, but evil is not real. The atheist says evil is real, but God doesn't exist. Our problem is we believe God exists and evil is real, so that's the problem.
Yeah, and if it is real, people say, why doesn't God do something about it?
That's exactly right, because if He's all-powerful, it seems like He could do something about it. If He's all good, it seems like He would do something about it, but it doesn't look like He's doing anything about it, so how can we have that kind of God?
Yeah, and this discussion that we're having is not just an intellectual one. I mean, it's an emotional thing because everybody that's watching has been faced or touched with this problem. You've been touched with it as well. You were close to 9/11 yourself. You were up in New York, weren't you?
Yes, I was. I was speaking to a Chinese group the week before, and I asked them a week or so after it happened, were any of your people in the tower, because I knew some of them worked there, and they said, well, our whole church was out to a restaurant the night before, and we all got food poisoning, and no one went to work that day. So that tells me that there is a God, and He is watching over His own.
All right, let's try to get a handle on this thing. If God is all good, and He's all powerful, and He's all loving, when He created, He would only create something good, okay? And we're saying that evil is real. Did God create evil?
It's a good question. If God created everything, and evil is something, it would look like God created evil. So we're in a painful dilemma. If we deny the first premise, that God created everything, then we're not really Christians, we're dualists that believe that good and evil are eternal or something. If we deny the second premise, it would look like we're pantheists, that we don't believe that evil is real. So the dilemma is real for a Christian. If God created everything and evil is something, then God created evil, but the Bible says God cannot even look on evil, Habakkuk 1:13. He's so pure. Holy, 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 the angels sing. So what do we do?
All right, well, that is the question. How do you handle it?
Well, St. Augustine struggled with this way back in the 400s. He was part of a Manichaean cult where they believed that evil and good were both eternal. And he struggled with it until he came to the conclusion that evil is a privation. It's a lack in something. Evil doesn't exist in itself. It's like a parasite. It exists in something else. For example, evil is like rust to a car. You have to have iron to have rust. So you have to have something good for evil to exist in it. It's like a wound in an arm. You can't have a wound unless you have an arm or a leg or something to have a wound in. Evil is like rot to a tree. You have to have a tree before you can have rot in it. So evil doesn't exist in itself, it only exists in something else. So the answer is God created everything, and everything he created was good. And so God created every good thing, but evil came and corrupted those good things. He didn't create the corruption. He created the uncorrupted thing that the corruption later came to.
Yeah, let's slow that down for people, because let's say that in one sense we're saying that evil is real, but it's not a thing. So that's hard for them to get a handle on. And let's slow that down. The fact is that when God made a perfect man, okay, he also gave him choice. And this is where the possibility comes in for evil taking place. Take it from there.
Yeah, I think the first thing we need to say, John, is that a privation is the lack in something. It's an absence of something that ought to be there. It's not nothing, it's real. For example, it's real to be blind, but blindness is a privation of sight. It's a lack of sight. It's real to be maimed. Tie your arm behind your back and walk around for a day and you'll say, well, that's a real handicap. Or close your eyes and walk around for a day and you'll say blindness is real. So evil is real, but it's a real lack in something that ought to be there. Then the question is, well, how did that lack get there? And that answer is, I think, free choice. God made us free creatures. Freedom makes evil possible. God made us perfectly good. He made us with the capacity to choose. We are the ones that brought evil in.
Yeah, I like going back to the privation, the lack. You use the word parasite. And I think that that helps us. You also have an illustration where you talk about, you know, a blind man and a rock. They can't see. But the blindness in the man, he's lacking something that should be there. Okay? The rock doesn't have it, but it shouldn't be there. So the fact is that this thing that should be there, which is lacking, that's the privation. And that's what you're saying this evil is that you had a perfectly good creature. All the stuff that should be there was there. Okay? But then this deal called free choice, man made a choice, and it affected him metaphysically, his being, by that choice. Now let's talk about that choice, because people mess up here. Talk about that choice a moment.
Well, freedom means that you could have done otherwise. You have the ability to love God or not love God. You have the ability to choose to go God's way or go your way. If you're not free, you're a robot. You know, God wasn't pulling puppet strings. We're not puppets that he made. We're persons, and persons are subjects. They're eyes. They're individuals that can make choices of their own for which they're responsible. So God made us like himself, in that he is a moral being, we're moral beings. He is a free being, we're free beings, and we made our free choice. You can't be free to love God if you're not free to hate God. You can't be free to worship God if you're not free to blaspheme God. So inherent in the very nature of making a free creature, which God did, is this possibility of evil. But the possibility of evil is not an evil. The possibility of evil is freedom, and freedom is a good thing.
Yeah. I mean, you're so good at just spouting these syllogisms, but I had a non-Christian professor spring this same kind of syllogism on me, and I want to roll through it, and I want you to unscramble it, okay? Same thing you said, just in other words. God's absolutely perfect. We all agree about that. God cannot create anything imperfect. We all agree with that one. And a perfect creature, he said, cannot do evil. We don't agree with that. You've got to tell us why in a moment. And therefore, evil, he said, cannot arise in such a world. But evil did arise. I mean, look around it. It's here, okay? Evil did arise in the world. Hence, either A, God's not absolutely perfect, or God did not create a perfect creature.
Yeah.
Okay? And those are false, because the premise C, a perfect creature cannot do evil, that's not right. Why?
It's not right because one of the perfections that God gave his creatures was free choice. free choice is a good. I've never seen anyone marching against freedom. You know, carrying a sign saying, down with freedom, back to bondage, I want to do everything my mother ever told me. Nobody ever marches against freedom. In fact, if you did march against freedom, you would be marching for it because you would be using your freedom to march against freedom. So even an act against freedom is an act of freedom, so you can't deny that freedom is a good. Even the people who say, well, I don't think it's good to be free, ask them, do you think it was good that you could say that? They believe it's good to be free. So freedom is a good, but freedom makes evil possible. A perfect being that has a perfect thing called free will can bring evil into the universe, and in fact did. His name was Lucifer, and the next one was named Adam.
All right, there's a couple questions right there, but let's start with a statement that you made in your book. God made evil possible via free will, which is good, okay? But free creatures made evil actual, all right? Question is, if a free creature is perfect, okay, what's even motivating him to choose evil? Because there's nothing in him to start with that is evil, because he was made perfect.
It's a good question. It's like asking who made God. No one made God. He was always there. What caused Lucifer to sin? No one caused him to sin. He was the cause of it. So you can't ask what's the cause of God since he's the first cause, and you can't ask what caused Lucifer to sin because he was the first cause. So it's what we call a category mistake. It's like asking where was the man when he jumped off the bridge? Say he was in the air. No, that was after he jumped. You say he was on the bridge. No, that was before he jumped. Where was he when he jumped off the bridge? Well, see, it's a category mistake because jumping is a process. So you can't ask a pinpoint location of a process activity. And you can't ask who made the one who made it, because the one who made it is the one who caused it. And Lucifer caused the first sin. Adam caused the first sin among human beings. And so their free will was the first cause of sin, and there is no cause of the first cause.
Yeah. I think that the hairy aspect of this, the important aspect, if I could put it that way, is that freedom all of a sudden comes with a ton of responsibility. Because what we're saying is that God gave us freedom, which is a good thing. But boy, I tell you, if you misuse that freedom, which we have done, the consequences are off the charts. Talk about some of the consequences that came, and maybe run through the choices. In other words, in Adam, the first man, how did this free creature who is perfect, you know, Augustine had a kind of neat way of talking about it. Run through that for the people. Keep it slow so we can understand here.
Well, basically, they had two choices. They could either go their way or God's way. God freely created them. He gave them freedom. Now, if they really have freedom, they can love him or hate him. They can worship him or blaspheme him. So what was the first sin? The first sin was the choice to choose the lesser good of my will over the greater good of God's will. So it wasn't a choice of evil. It was an evil choice. There was no evil to choose because there was God and there were all his perfect creatures, and there was no evil in the environment. There was no evil around them. There was no evil within them. So what their choice was the choice to go their way rather than God's way, to will the lesser good of the creature over the greater good of the Creator. That's how evil entered the world. When a good creature, using a good thing called free will, willed a lesser good over the greater good. It's called pride.
Yeah, we're going to take a break. When we come back, I'm going to talk about, man, the consequences are spectacular, okay? And God knew those consequences, so that becomes a part of the problem. When we look at all that's here, see if God foreknew it, if he had knowledge in advance that all this stuff was going to come about, for some reason, he still decided to create. Okay, we want to talk about what that reason is when we come right back. All right, we're back. We're talking with Dr. Norman Geisler about the problem of evil. Why is it that we experience and we have so much evil and suffering and pain in the world? Why are there events such as 9/11? Why do we have a Saddam Hussein who tortures children? If God's all-powerful, all-loving, where is he? Why doesn't he stop to intervene these things? Well, we're going to get to that next week, but the fact is this week we're on what is the origin of evil? What is the nature of evil? And we've talked about that, but we've seen that God gave free choice, and I'm impressed with the fact that when God gave man free choice, whether or not he wanted to serve that God, to love that God, to be in fellowship with that God, he chose to go the other way. And I'm impressed, I guess, with the consequences, the bigness of that decision. Talk about those consequences of violating free choice.
Well, the consequences are very simple. You can either go the right way or the wrong way. You can will the good of the creature over that of the Creator and end up in misery and ultimately in hell, or you can will the good of the Creator over that of the creature and end up in heaven. Remember C.S. Lewis' famous line, there are only two kinds of people in the end, those that say, "Thy will be done, O God." They end up in heaven. Those that God says to them, "Thy will be done," they end up in hell. So those are pretty serious consequences, and we can talk about, physical and social consequences, but the eternal consequences are far greater. Are you going to live in harmony with the Creator, or are you going to live in eternal rebellion against the Creator?
We're actually trying to defend God's reputation in this program in examining the problem of evil, right?
That's right. It's called theodicy, which means how can we justify God in the light of the problem of evil?
Yeah, and I mean, every time something bad happens in the world, it's very interesting that people say, that shouldn't happen. And that would imply there ought to be somebody there taking care of it.
Mm-hmm.
There ought to be an ultimate standard. There ought to be God. Okay, talk a little bit about that.
Well, first of all, I think the thing to point out in this whole issue, John, is that the problem of evil boomerangs for the unbeliever. Boomerangs because they like to say there's evil, therefore there can't be a God. Just the opposite is true. If there's evil, there must be a God, because you can't know something is wrong unless you know what's right. You can't know something is unjust unless you know what just is. And you can't certainly know that something is ultimately unjust unless there's an ultimate standard of justice. But God is the ultimate standard of justice, so you have to posit God to attack God, arguing in a circle.
Yeah, define the God that we're talking about, that we're defending.
We're talking about God who's all-powerful, who's all good, who's free, who is all-knowing. That's called a theistic God, the God of the Bible. That kind of God is not only a problem in the face of evil, but it turns out he's the only solution to the problem of evil.
Why is he the solution and also the guarantee that evil is going to be taken care of?
Because if he's not all-powerful, you can't be sure that he'll overpower it. If he's not all good, you can't be sure that he has the desire to do it. And if he doesn't know the end from the beginning, then you're dealing with somebody who's fumbling along in history and doesn't know how it's going to come out.
Okay, but even in talking about the attributes of God, that's one of the things we got to talk about, because here's the question. God freely decided, he chose to create this world. And because he does have all knowledge, he knew in advance it would turn against him and would bring upon itself and others untold human misery and woe, the stuff that we don't like. He knew that in advance before he created. People say, then why did he create? There's got to be a really good reason here, Norman.
No pain, no gain. God knew in advance that evil would come. He also knew in advance that he could bring a greater good out of it. You remember what Joseph said to his brothers in Genesis 50, verse 20. You meant it for evil. God meant it for good. And they were saved as a result of that tragedy. God permits evil in order to produce a greater good.
But for the guy that's on his hospital bed that has had an accident or has just found out he's got cancer, to say no pain, no gain doesn't take him very far. What else can you say to him?
Well, you can say to him, no suffering seems good for the present, Hebrews 12:11. You can say to him, 2 Corinthians 4:16, our light affliction, which is but for a moment, works for us a far more exceeding and greater weight of glory. Of course it isn't good, it doesn't seem good, and it feels painful. That's the whole point. There's no other way to accomplish it. You can't get to the promised land without going through the wilderness. Christians are like tea. Their real strength comes out when they get in hot water. And God has to let us get in the hot water in order to produce, because Romans 5 says, no tribulation, no patience.
All right, frame it. We've only got a few minutes left. What does the content that we've even discussed today, first of all, tell us about the God we're talking about?
It tells us that he's all good. It tells us that he's all powerful. If he's all good, he has a good purpose for everything that happens. If he's all powerful, he can bring a good out of evil. And he's all knowing, so he knows where this thing is going. He's not a divine architect of the universe that builds staircases that lead to nowhere. Every staircase that looks like it's going nowhere to us is going somewhere to him, and you can be sure of it.
How is it encouraging? How is it good for us to know the nature of evil?
All is good that ends good. All is well that ends well, we say. So if we know that it's just temporary, if we know it has a good purpose in mind, then we can endure it a whole lot more easily than if we don't know where it's going and we don't know there's anyone who knows where it's going.
Why is it good to know that evil originated with free choice and God didn't create it?
Because then you know that God is absolutely good. You know that God is not evil in any sense, because if he originated evil, then he's evil.
And how can a person who says, I'd like to come into a relationship with that God, I didn't even know that I could, how do you get to know him personally? What has he made possible for us?
He's made possible for us the solution to evil. See, and the encouraging thing is this God is not only all-powerful, but he's all-loving. And he's permitting this evil for a purpose. In fact, he permitted the greatest evil that has ever occurred on earth to his own son. He permitted him to go to the cross, to die for our sins, to rise from the dead, that we can be delivered from evil. So God permitted evil to defeat evil. He permitted his son suffering so that we wouldn't have to suffer forever. He permitted evil in our lives to remind us, as Lewis said in his great book, The Problem of Pain, evil is God's megaphone to arouse a morally deaf world. And so all these evil circumstances are to turn us to God. I was lying in the hospital in 1954 with hepatitis, looking up. That's the only way you can look when you're lying on your back. And believe me, God had my attention, because God shouts to us in our pain. Pain is God's megaphone to arouse a morally deaf world.
All right, I sure appreciate all this. Now, some of you that are listening are saying, hey, but Norman, you haven't talked about this, that, and the other, and you got 15 more questions. We're just getting started, and one of the things, if God is all-powerful, and we agree that he could stop evil, why doesn't he do it right now? Why doesn't he do it immediately? And we're going to pick up that question next week. I hope that you'll join us. Welcome. We're talking about the problem of evil. I can remember sitting at the bedside of my mother, who was dying with Lou Gehrig's disease. And I was thinking, if God is all-loving and all-powerful, why is it that he doesn't help my mother? And maybe you've gone through an experience like that. Maybe you've had a tragedy that's taken place in your family, the death of a loved one. Maybe you right now are suffering with a cancer or a heart attack or something that was a surprise to you. If God is all-loving, how do you continue to believe in him if the problems of our world do not straighten out? Why doesn't God intervene and stop it all? My guest that's going to help us to discover and explain the biblical and philosophical answers is philosopher, theologian, my good friend Dr. Norman Geisler. He's president of Southern Evangelical Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina. And Norman, I had you as a guest when we had a debate with Rabbi Harold Kushner, the man who wrote the best-selling book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And at that time, he was telling us about his 12-year-old son that died of a terrible disease, and it caused him to rethink what he believed about God. And he had to give up, he felt, one of the attributes of God. He held on to God is all-loving, but he gave up the fact that God is all-powerful. God is so loving, he'd like to get involved, but he can't help defeat evil in certain cases. So we got to help him. So he's taking that view, and you were telling him why he didn't have to hold that view. But since that time, you have also experienced the death of one of your children, one of your daughters. And when you go through a tragedy like that, you really start to rethink all of your views. You test them. And people that are listening right now, they'd probably want to ask you and say, when you went through that and you went back on the very things that you're explaining to us, did it work for you? Does it still make sense? Was it helpful for you? Is this something that really is what people need to latch onto?
I remember that very well, John. I remember saying to Rabbi Kushner, I empathize with you, I sympathize with you, but you know, your God is not the kind of God that can give you any ultimate comfort in this, because you're not even sure you'll see your son again, because you didn't even believe that he would live on after death for sure. And I said, your God is not all powerful, and he can't bring good out of evil. So the kind of God you need is the kind of God who's in the Bible, who's all powerful and all good and all knowing, and can do something for your situation. Never knowing at the time that I would go through things that probably are as equally difficult or worse than Rabbi Kushner did. Since that time, in 18 months, we lost a father, a mother, a sister, a brother-in-law, and our two closest friends. And I'd been a pastor for years, and I'd comforted people in their sorrow and in their suffering. But I wasn't ready for the biggest evil that ever hit me when our daughter died a tragic death just 2 years ago. And it's just something, John, that you have to experience to understand. It's like a 100-foot tall tidal wave coming at you, and you know you can't swim. And I had to cast myself on the grace of God and trust that what I believed was really true. My grace is sufficient for you, the Apostle Paul said in 2 Corinthians 12. And I would wake up at night singing songs on the attributes of God. God is light, God is good, God is eternal, God is gracious, it is well with my soul, peace like a river. All these great hymns of the faith that talk about the attributes of God were the only comfort I had, because everything human had evaporated. The best things around me, father, mother, brothers, sisters, and now daughter, that tragedy was so great in our lives that we tested the grace of God, we tested the character of God, and we found him to be faithful, absolutely unimaginably faithful to us. And the grace of God brought us through that difficult circumstance only because I knew that God was all loving and he had a good purpose for it. He was all powerful, and he was going to bring something greater out of it. And I was going to see my mother, my father, my sister, brother, daughter again someday in heaven, because he could resurrect the dead and is going to resurrect them. And that was the strength that kept us going, and we made it through that very difficult circumstance.
Yeah, I was so moved when I heard that, and when I talked with you. One thing among the many things that stood out in my mind is you said, you know, John, I kind of rethought, went over all the stuff that I've been teaching all of these years, and I found out it's true. And boy, that really stuck in my mind. But now let me come back with that in mind, that on the table. Why did God allow it to happen? And why doesn't God stop that kind of stuff from happening? Because he is all powerful and he does care. Let's start with, where did this evil originate? Why do we have the kind of world that we have? What was in God's mind?
Before I answer that, I want to say one other thing, John. I had a friend who lost her daughter. Farm machine sucked her into the instrument, and she was killed and left 4 children behind. And she sent us an encouraging card when we lost our daughter. She said, in the end, there are only 3 things that help: God, prayer, and friends. And that's so important in these times of suffering. And I had friends like you and Josh McDowell and Hank Hanegraaff and some of the top Christian leaders in the world had left little phone messages because I wasn't home. I was out doing funeral arrangement. And the most encouraging things that I heard can be summed up in these 4 words. I love you. I'm praying for you. I'm grieving with you. and it's not your fault. And I want to thank you because you were the only one out of all the people who said all four of those things to me in that phone message, and that's really encouraging.
I appreciate you saying that, but let's go back, because I'm thinking of all the people that are listening to us that are now empathizing. They've got the same kind of problem, but they don't have the knowledge that you have about our wonderful God. And for people that are just joining us this week and they missed last week, where did this problem originate? Why do we have evil in the world?
Well, God created good creatures. He gave them a good thing called free will, and free will brought bad things into this world, namely rebellion against God. Freedom is good in itself, but it has the possibility of evil. God created us with the possibility for evil, which is called free will. We made the actuality of evil. God is responsible for the fact of freedom. We're responsible for the acts of freedom, and we blew it. Lucifer blew it, Adam and Eve blew it, and we've blown it ever since then. That's how it got here.
When people get mad at God, should they be?
No, they should be mad at themselves. They should be mad at themselves because they made the choice. They made their bed, and they're going to have to lie in it. They chose, and they're living with the consequences of their freedom. If somebody jumps off a cliff to commit suicide, he shouldn't be mad at God when he hits the bottom. He made the choice.
Okay, but God was the one with all power. He's the creator, and he made it, plus he had the knowledge that this thing was going to get screwed up in the end. Okay? Now, the fact is, knowing the sin and the problems, knowing the death of your daughter, 9/11, all kinds of events like that, there was something in God's thinking that said, I will allow that to happen. What was the purpose in his mind at that point?
You can summarize in 3 verses from the Bible. Genesis 26, he said, do not go down into Egypt. Egypt was the place of unbelief and sin. Genesis 46, he said, go now down to Egypt. And in Hosea 11, he says, out of Egypt I have brought my son. God's perfect will is don't sin. His permissive will is okay, I'll let you sin. His providential will is out of sin, I'm going to bring a greater good. You meant it for evil, God meant it for good, Joseph said. So God allowed evil because he knew he could bring a greater good. No pain, no gain, no tribulation, no patience. Don't allow sin, can't achieve forgiveness.
Yeah, people have taken different options when they have faced evil. Okay, let me give you a couple of syllogisms and you explain what's behind these things. Some critics will say, you know, either God is not all loving, God is not powerful enough to defeat evil, or evil shows that God doesn't exist at all. It's not a syllogism, those are just statements that people make, and there's something behind each one of those. The first one, God's not all loving.
Yeah, the syllogism is just a little logical way to put together the dilemma. The dilemma is this: if God is all powerful, he could destroy evil. If he's all good, he would destroy evil, but evil hasn't been destroyed. It's still here. Look at the newspaper, look at the TV, look in the mirror. Then how can he have an all-powerful and all-good God? And the problem with that way of putting it is that they forget that the middle, the second premise, as it's called in the syllogism, is that evil is still here, but what they should say is evil has not yet been destroyed or defeated. Now, once you say that, because God may yet defeat it tomorrow, so they have to rephrase it and say if he's all powerful, he could. If he's all good, he would. Evil has not yet been defeated, therefore it never will be. But how do you know that? Unless you're God, you can't know everything. So they have to pretend they're God, know everything, in order to know that it won't work. And if they back off and say, well, evil is not yet defeated, and I can't tell you whether it ever will be, then we say to them, hang on, it's coming. If he's all-knowing, he knows the end from the beginning. If he's all-powerful, he can bring a greater good. If he's all good, he wants to do it. So if he wants to do it and he can do it, and he knows the end and he knows it's going to be done, then just hang on, it's coming.
All right, we're going to take a break, but when we come back, I want to push you further on that, because there might be a guy that's laying in the bed right now saying, you know, you're talking about the fact this is going to come, but I'm suffering big time right now. I'd like to believe in a God that could stop it now. Why doesn't he stop it now? what's going on, and oh, by the way, what's the hook that I should base all of my hope that he's going to do something in the future like you're saying. So both sides of that coin, talk about it when we come right back. Stick with us. All right, we're back. We're talking with philosopher, theologian, Dr. Norman Geisler about the problem of evil. All of us who believe in God have to come to grips with why is there so much evil, suffering, and pain in the world? And it centers right at where we're at. If God's all loving, he loves us. He doesn't want that kind of thing for us, but he has permitted it, okay? But he also has the power to stop it anytime he wants to. People want to know, why is it that he hasn't stopped it? Why doesn't he stop it right now if he's got the power to do so?
Well, we could stop an operation right in the middle, too, and say this is too painful, but it would be the wrong time to stop it, wouldn't it? We could stop the dentist right in the middle of the dentist chair, but it would be the wrong time. He's got to get the abscess tooth out, and God knows the right time, and he knows how much tribulation is going to work patience and how much pain is necessary to produce the greater good in our life. If he's all-knowing, he knows the right amount and the right time. If he's all good, he'll give his goodness in producing that greater good in our life. So while we think that it's too long, and we cry out, how long, O Lord, as Isaiah said, he knows exactly how much is needed in our life to achieve what he's trying to get.
Atheists hook onto your syllogism and they use it this way, okay? If God's all good, and we say that he is, he would defeat evil. If God's all powerful, he could defeat evil. But then they say, but evil never will be defeated. In other words, it's going to go on just the way it is here. Therefore, no such God exists. This is all, you're all pipe dreaming here.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what they're doing, because they don't know the end from the beginning as the God of Isaiah does. They don't know how things are going to turn out, and God does. So God, who knows everything, and God, who is all good, permits this, knowing exactly how much it will take to achieve his greater good in the end. And he knows the end from the beginning, and he knows it's going to turn out well, because he's planned it that way, that he would permit evil to achieve the greater good. He would permit pain to produce the ultimate pleasure. He would let us go through the wilderness in order that we can get to the promised land. And of course, when we get to the promised land and we look back on it, we're going to say what Paul did in 2 Corinthians 4:16. This light affliction, which is but for a moment, worked for us a far more exceeding and greater weight of glory.
Yeah, I think to the atheist who says it, you have a great note in your book. There's no way for the atheist to know evil never will be defeated unless he is God himself.
Yeah, he'd have to be omniscient. He'd have to know everything in order to know that it's never going to turn out well.
But let's come back to the guy that is in his bed and he's sick and he is suffering like my mom, okay? He's in it right now, okay? What is the basis? What are the hooks that he can grab onto that says, I can hope that it will be defeated someday up ahead?
I think it was about 1958. I was listening to Paul Harvey one day. He said he went into the hospital to visit a young man dying of cancer. He went in to comfort him, and he came out comforted because the young man looked at him and said, Paul, I don't believe that the divine architect of the universe ever builds a staircase that leads to nowhere. If you know you have a divine architect, and he knows everything and he's all good, you can be absolutely sure that it's leading somewhere. I've been in that kind of bed. I've been there lying on my back dying of hepatitis, couldn't raise my hand. My wife and church were praying for me. And somebody gave me a poem I'll never forget. It was called Overheard in an Orchard. Said, the robin to the sparrow, I should really like to know why these anxious human beings rush about and worry so. Said the sparrow to the robin, I think that it must be that they have no heavenly Father such as cares for you and me. That's the answer.
That's powerful. There's an important definition, a couple definitions that you give in your books. It has to do with the word destroying evil and defeating evil. What's the difference? What's the importance here?
Well, let's take the little logical statement. If God is all-powerful, he can destroy evil. If he's all good, he would destroy evil. Evil is not destroyed, therefore there's no such God. Well, the truth of the matter is God cannot destroy evil without destroying the greater good, because freedom is what makes the good possible, and the only way he could totally destroy evil is destroy freedom. For example, God could, every time somebody picked up a gun to shoot someone else, he could destroy the gun right in his hand. Every time somebody took a knife to stab someone else, he could turn the knife into butter, or every time somebody put a noose around somebody's neck, he could turn it into a noodle. But if he did that, he would also be destroying their freedom. Remember Madalyn Murray O'Hair?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we don't have anyone like her anymore, but anyway, God could have stopped a lot of evil when she was running around the country mouthing off about God. All he had to do is stuff her mouth full of cotton. God could have, but if he had done that, then she wouldn't be free, would she? Or every time she lifted her fountain pen to write an atheist book, he could have exploded the fountain pen in her hand. Then she wouldn't be free to express. Or God could have given her an Excedrin headache #2 every time she thought an atheistic thought. Then she wouldn't have been free to think. God made us free to think, free to choose, free to express ourselves. And the only way to destroy all evil is to destroy all freedom, but then you've destroyed the possibility of the greater good. So destroy is not the word. Defeat is the right word. Can God defeat evil without destroying freedom? The answer is yes, and here's how he does it. Gives everybody their free choice. You want to follow me forever, or you want to go your own way forever? As C.S. Lewis said in The Great Divorce, there are only two kinds of people in the end. One says, "Thy will be done, O God." The other one says to them, "Thy will be done." That's an awesome choice, right? He gives everybody their choice, and then he allows everyone to have their choice forever. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote a play called No Exit, and the irony of the 20th century, the last century, is that the greatest insights into hell came from atheists. Nietzsche said that I would rather will nothingness than not to will at all in The Genealogy of Moral. Jean-Paul Sartre said in his play No Exit, the door of hell opened, and they were all given a chance to leave, and nobody left. Why? They're all condemned to their own freedom. They chose to be there. The door of hell is locked on the inside. So the way God defeats evil without destroying freedom is he allows everybody to make their choice, and then he says to them, "You've got it." You remember Milton's Paradise Lost? Satan said, "I would rather reign in hell than serve in heaven." To which I respond, God says, "You've got it. You've got it."
Yeah, I think that separating good from evil forever according to what man chooses, of not bullying men and saying, because I'm God, I'm going to force you to think my way, but of actually going way beyond that and saying, I'm going to give you dignity and a real choice. And also, he's made it possible for us to be forgiven. It's already been done, and it's sitting there waiting for us that we can have this relationship with God forever, but he won't force us into it. I think it's absolutely astonishing when you realize that's the case.
It is, and Jesus is a perfect example. Matthew 23. He's weeping, "O Jerusalem, how often I would have gathered you together as a mother hen gathers her chicks, but you were not willing." God will not force us into the fold. There's no divine arm twisting. God is a loving Father. He works persuasively but not coercively. If a young man said to a young lady, "I love you, I want you to marry me," and she said no, and he said, "I love you so much, I'm going to force you to love me," you say, wait a minute, forced love is not love. Forced love is rape, and God is not a divine rapist. He will not force anyone to love him. That's why there has to be a hell, not just because he's just and must punish sin, but because he's loving and can't force free creatures against their freedom, because forced freedom is a contradiction in terms.
Give a word of encouragement to the person that is without hope right now, maybe because of circumstances, maybe just because they've never thought about God this way. Talk about the loving God and the possibility of knowing him in a personal relationship and what they have to do to have it right now.
God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. He just doesn't love some people, he loves all people. God loves you. He sent his Son to die for you. He's paid the penalty for your sin. He doesn't want you to suffer, and he's got a place where there'll be no suffering, no sin, no death, no sorrow forever. If that's not hope, what is hope?
So much more, and I'm sure there's so many more questions that are coming up in your mind. Join us next week. We're just getting started again in a series of programs that are dealing with the topics surrounding the problem of evil. And next week, a humdinger. Why does God allow suffering? And how come physical evils, such as earthquakes and tornadoes and cancer, how can they be explained in the scenario that we're talking about? Okay? So important. I hope that you'll join us.
Today on the John Ankerberg Show, why does God allow evil and suffering in the world? If you've ever sat by the bedside of a loved one and watched them die from some terrible disease, or you've lived through an earthquake, a hurricane, or a tornado, then you've probably asked, how could God let this happen? Isn't He supposed to be all-loving and all-powerful? How can there be any good purpose behind all of this? And if there is, what is it? To help us understand the biblical and philosophical answers regarding evil, my guest today is Dr. Norman Geisler, philosopher, theologian, and president of Southern Evangelical Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina. Dr. Geisler is the author of more than 50 books and is considered by many to be the greatest living Christian apologist. As Americans think back on the events of 9/11, many still ask, why did God allow such horrible suffering and death to happen to thousands of innocent people? We invite you to hear this important topic that touches every one of us.
Welcome to our program. Boy, do we have a program for you today. Why does God allow suffering? Is that a big enough topic for you? My guest was telling his students in a lecture on a tape that I heard. I couldn't believe this little story that you told. A man was out mowing his yard, and he was in the backyard. And you said a stoplight came out of the sky and killed him. So all the kids said, well, where in the world did the stoplight come from? In front of the house, on the corner, there was a stoplight, and a truck went through the corner, hit the stoplight, and hit it so hard it went right over the roof of the house and came down in the yard and killed him. Now, we all have those kinds of stories. The problem is when you believe in an all-loving, all-powerful God who knows everything, you say, why does He allow stuff like that to happen? I was in a social event where I met two older folks, and as kids, they had both been in the Holocaust. And the man had grown up in Auschwitz and some of the other camps. And as a young child, he had watched other children cut up and killed right in front of him. So he left his belief in God, and we got talking. Why such cruelty? Why such sin and suffering, pain, terrorism? Why does an all-loving God permit this? You need to help us out here in a big-time way. Why does God allow physical suffering?
Well, there are 2 points I'd like to make there, John. One is made by Rabbi Kushner, strangely enough, in his book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. He interviewed a lady who had been through the Holocaust, and she said, it never occurred to me to blame God for the Holocaust. God was not the cause of this event. Wicked, sinful human beings were the cause of the event. Second thing is, that isn't it interesting that some people get bitter through suffering and some people get better through suffering? So there must be a key. Johnny Erickson Tada is a good example of somebody who got better through suffering. The atheist and the agnostic gets bitter. Depends on how you respond to it. If you respond to it positively, saying, I don't understand it completely, but I believe that God is loving, He has a good purpose for this, and He'll bring about His good purpose, then you'll grow through it. It'll be a stepping stone. If you charge God foolishly, as Job's phrase reminds us, then you're going to get bitter because you're charging the one in the universe who can do something about it, who loves you, who's allowed this to happen for a good purpose in your life, and you're just going to get bitter as a result rather than better. It's going to be a stumbling stone rather than a stepping stone.
Yeah, but when you lost your daughter, as you were talking about last week, you probably were with a lot of other people that there are moments where you say, why? You want to understand why, okay? And that's what we need your help on. What went through your mind when that event happened? How did you put that in context? Because it really, really hurt.
It never occurred to me to blame God. See, if you have the proper biblical view of God going into an experience like that, it makes all the difference in the world. I knew God is loving. I knew God is all-powerful. I knew God had a good purpose, even if I couldn't figure out what the purpose was. There's a big difference in not knowing why and knowing the one who does know why. At least I know why, I don't know why. I'm finite, I'm fallible, I don't know everything, but I know the one who does know why. And you can get through a situation if you don't know why, if you know the one who does know why. And you know he's a divine architect of the universe, as Paul Harvey said, who doesn't build a staircase that leads to nowhere. If it looks like it's going nowhere, mark it down. It's going somewhere, and God knows where it's going. And if you keep on the path, he's going to show you where it leads.
All right, we're going to talk about pain and suffering, but before we do, give us the big picture of what God intended here. What is evil? Where did it come from? Why did God permit it? Where are we going?
The big picture is there's an all-good God who made good creatures, gave those good creatures a good thing called free will. They abused that freedom and brought evil in the universe. God knew that was going to happen, and he had pre-planned to bring a greater good out of evil. This is not the best of all possible worlds, as Leibniz said in his Theodicy. And Candide wrote the satire on it, saying that this is not the best of all possible worlds. But it is the best of all possible ways to get to the best of all possible worlds. And the big picture is this. The best of all possible beings, God, made the best of all possible worlds, which was one in which we're free. We brought evil. He's going to bring a greater good out of it in the end, so that by permitting evil, he is going to defeat evil. He's going to separate the good from the evil, which has to be done because evil is what frustrates good people. Good is what frustrates evil people. I used to work on the assembly line in Detroit when I was going through school, and what frustrated me? People telling their filthy stories, blowing their smoke in my face. You know what frustrated them? Me reading my Bible, testifying to them, well, God has a solution. The wheat and the tare grow together till the harvest. Finally, they're separated, and there's a place where there's no more evil that frustrates good people. It's called heaven. And there's a place where there's no more good that frustrates evil people. It's called hell.
Let me throw in, people are really free. They get to make these big choices, okay? Sideline, predestination, foreknowledge, and free choice. Is it really free? People want to know. Define those for us.
Well, predestination means that God simply determines the end from the beginning. As Isaiah said, he knows in advance exactly how things are going to go out. He knows exactly who's going to be in heaven, exactly who's going to be in hell, and everything in between. Free will means that they had the ability to do otherwise. They made a free choice. They could have done otherwise. They weren't forced to do it. It was an uncoerced act. Can they be reconciled? Yes, because God knew for sure. That means it's determined, because if he knows something for sure, it has to happen. If it didn't happen, he would have been wrong, and then he wouldn't have been all-knowing. If he's all-knowing and he knows it's going to happen, it has to happen. So it's determined. But he knew for sure that they were freely going to do it. So it was determined from the standpoint of his foreknowledge, free from the standpoint of their choice. For example, my wife tapes my favorite football team when I'm on the road. On Sunday, I come home and the game's all taped. Now, everything in that game is determined. The score is determined. Every time I play the video, it comes out the same. Score is the same. Every play is the same. So everything is determined. But every play was freely chosen. They chose to be on that team. They chose that play. They chose to go around over tackle. So it's determined, but it's free. You say, well, that's looking backwards. But God can look forward with the same ability we look backward. So he can see free choices in the future. They're determined from the standpoint of his knowledge, free from the standpoint of our choice. 1 Peter 1:2, elect according to the foreknowledge of God. Romans 8:29, whom he foreknew, he did predestine.
Yeah, use Judas. You use Judas as an illustration.
Good illustration. God knew that Judas was going to betray Christ. So if you take the logic this way, God knew Judas would betray Christ, true. If God knew Judas was going to betray Christ, then Judas must betray Christ, true. Otherwise, God would have been wrong. Therefore, Judas wasn't free, false, because he knew that Judas would freely betray Christ. Even the Westminster Confession, Calvinistic confession, says that there are secondary causes and that all things do not follow from necessary order of causes. Some are free. So God knew for sure that Judas would freely betray Christ. Judas was responsible for his free choice. God is responsible for his foreknowledge.
Yeah, that necessary choices that you just flipped through so easy, freezes the rest of us lay people that don't know what you philosophers are talking about. You have this great illustration with dominoes about necessary choices. Talk about that.
Well, if you push the first domino, it's necessary that the last one is going to fall.
Necessary cause.
Because one necessarily falls on the other, and they fall, and there's no free will. But if you put a human being in the middle and put, say, 100 dominoes up to him, and you push the first one, and then there's 100 dominoes after that free being, then you don't know for sure whether he's going to nudge the next domino or not. You know for sure the first 100 are going to fall, but you don't know for sure if this free being is going to choose to push the next domino. So there's the difference between freedom. God, however, knows not only necessary causes that all 100 will fall, he knows whether that person is going to push the next one, and the next 100 are going to fall.
Why is it possible for God to be able to do that?
It's possible for God to be able to do that because he is outside of time.
Right.
He's not in time. He's eternal. Here's a tunnel. There's somebody in a cave. They're looking out, and a train's going by. There are 3 cars in the train. He's looking at one car. That's all he can see. He's got tunnel vision, time. He doesn't see the one that's gone past. He doesn't see the one yet coming. There's somebody standing on top of that mountain over that cave, and he sees all 3 cars at the same time, past, present, and future. So God, from the pinnacle of eternity, is looking down on the whole course of time. He sees past, present, and future all in his present. We see only the present moment, not the past one, not the future one.
Not only that, but even we as people, we could be on a mountain and we could see a collision that was going to happen between 2 cars, and we can know it even in advance, but that doesn't mean that we're making it happen.
Sure, if you were standing on top of a skyscraper and there were roads on each side, and you could foresee a head-on collision coming, car coming this way and a car coming that way, and foresee they're going to collide. You didn't cause the accident, you just foresaw it.
Now, the reason I made you go through all of that, because that's important to a whole lot of people to say, am I really free in choosing what God is offering? So let's get down to how big a freedom, how important a freedom has God given to us people?
Scary, radical freedom. Such freedom that he will allow us to say no to him forever. It's pretty scary freedom. Such freedom that he will allow us to have our own way eternally. Nietzsche is the classic example in his last line of Genealogy of Morals. He said, I would rather will nothingness than not to will at all. So if Nietzsche were to stand before God someday, and God would say to him, Fred, that was his first name, Fred, I'll give you 3 choices. 1, I'm going to wipe you out of existence, snuff you out of existence. 2, you can repent of all those evil things you said. He said, God is dead, Christ is an idiot, and Christians are nincompoops, for example. So I'm going to repent of all those things you said. Or 3, I'll let you go on thinking and willing what you want to think and will forever. Which one would he choose? He told us. The 3rd one. Because to snuff him out of existence would be like me saying to my son, I want you to grow up and be a doctor. He grew up and became a plumber, so I shoot him. No, God is not that kind of father. I mean, he's a loving father, and he will give us space. He will give us the freedom to make our own choices. Jesus said in Matthew 23, how oft I would have gathered you together as a mother hen gathers her chicks, but you were not willing. He didn't force them. 2 Peter 3:9, God is long-suffering, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repent, change their mind. So God gives us the freedom. It's a radical freedom, and he allows us to make a choice to thumb our nose at him forever. And he just says, thy will be done.
People have to understand what you're saying, and it's so true, and it blows my mind that God brought us into existence, gave us absolute freedom to choose whether we're going to accept him or reject him, and he's going to live with our decision. He is not going to force us, even though he could. That's how free we are, and that's how important it is that we understand this information. Now, we haven't even gotten to the physical sufferings that a lot of us go through and why God permits that, and to the extent that we have it. We're going to talk about that. We're going to take a break. We'll be right back. We're back. We're talking with Dr. Norman Geisler, our philosopher theologian who is president of Southern Evangelical Seminary. And we're talking about why does God allow suffering? How can physical evils like earthquakes, tornadoes, and cancer be explained in God's good world? And that brings us to the purpose. Let's talk about the purpose for these things. Talk to us.
Well, the problem is if God is all good, he has to have a good purpose for everything. But reality shows us that there's some things for which there's no good purpose. There's no good purpose for throwing babies in the air and catching them on bayonets, as you know, the brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky's novel show. There's no good purpose for innocent people being killed or suffering, and we can all think of illustrations where there was just no good purpose for it. Well, now, if there's no good purpose for any one thing in the universe, then God can't be all good, because if he's an all-good God, he has a good purpose for all. But if there's something for which there's no good purpose, then he can't be an all-good God. So that's the painful dilemma.
And I mean, we're talking just one
just
thing.
one.
So anybody that's listening, if you got one gripe at God, you're saying this should not have happened.
That's it.
We're talking your tune right now. So what's the?
So it's a powerful argument. Dr. Mervodes, who is a PhD in philosophy, taught at University of Michigan, wrote a book years ago, Belief in God. Now, here's a brilliant philosopher, teaches at one of the top secular schools in the country, and he made this simple distinction. He said there's a big difference between saying, I do not know the purpose for this event, and there is no purpose. As a matter of fact, there are a lot of things that I don't know the purpose for, and I can't explain all of it. I can't explain why your loved one died. I can't explain why you lost your job, why your daughter died. I can't explain all those things. But I know there is an explanation, and here's why. Because I know there is an all-good God who is all-knowing. Now, if he's all-knowing, he knows everything. If he's all-good, he has a good purpose for everything. So even if I don't know it, I know God knows it. And I also know that there are good reasons for me not knowing it. Deuteronomy 29:29 says, the secret things belong unto the Lord our God, but to us and to our children, the things that are revealed. Romans 11:33, his ways are unsearchable and his judgments past finding out. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not to your own understanding, Proverbs 3:5 and following. So we know that we don't know the good purpose for everything, but we know the one who does know the good purpose for everything. And what the atheist would have to show to make his argument stick is there is no good purpose for some events, and no one knows any good purpose. Well, he'd have to be omniscient. He'd have to be God to know that. He would have to know everything to know that there's no one in the universe who knows a good purpose for this suffering. And even though I don't see it, sometimes, given enough time, even in this lifetime, I figured, oh, that's why my loved one died. So-and-so came to the Lord. That changed somebody else's life. And I can look back and see, even in my lifetime, many things I couldn't explain at the time. Later I saw, yes, God did have a good purpose, and in fact, we know some of those good purposes.
The critics will come back on you and say that might be true philosophically. But we've got two things going on. We got moral evil, which we could say comes from our free choice. But hey, we also got physical evil that I didn't choose. And they put it in a syllogism this way. Moral evil can be explained by free will. All right, we'll grant you that one. But physical evil does not result from free will. We're talking about earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, meteors, floods, genetic deformity, cancer. You know, I didn't choose that, Norman. Hence, Physical evils cannot be explained by free choice. That is, no one chooses to have these things. So where and why do these things come to us?
It's a good question, and it's a good topic for a whole program. Maybe we can do a whole program on it. Let me give you just a little short answer for it. We do see that there's a good purpose for many evils in our life, and we do see that they're all connected with free will. For example, if I freely abuse my body, say for example, smoke myself to cancer of the lungs and die of cancer of the lungs, whose fault is it? That was a free choice. I brought a physical evil on myself. If I use my freedom and become a drunk and abuse my children, my free choice was the result of the evil that's happening on somebody else. So there's a lot of the evil in the universe can be explained by free choices that bring evil directly on ourselves and directly on someone else.
All right, I think you've got a whole list of 10 things that we need to go through. We haven't got time in this program, but let's start off with something that we can understand that starts to chip away at this problem. Philip Yancey, in his book, Where's God When It Hurts?, has some great stuff that we can understand. Take us through that in terms of leprosy, pain, suffering. Why does God allow us to have pain? We can understand this action.
It's a great story, and it illustrates C.S. Lewis's line that we need to get before us from his book, The Problem of Pain, which is an excellent book for people. God whispers to us in our pleasure, speaks to us in our conscience, but shouts to us in our pain. Pain is God's megaphone to arouse a morally deaf world. I'll put images on that. You're lying on the beach, the breeze is blowing through the palms, and you're saying, and God is whispering, I'm good. You know, or you're speeding down the highway, you see a red flashing light in the mirror, and you feel a little in your gut, and it's a policeman. That's conscience. That's God speaks a little louder. You're lying in a hospital bed, your leg is up in the air, there are bandages around you, look like a mummy, and you're just reeking with pain. God's shouting to you, see. This is the image behind it. So what Philip Yancey said, and it was based on the work of the famous leprosy doctor Blanchard, who discovered that leprosy does not destroy people's fingers and toes, and we see all these gross pictures. Leprosy destroys their ability to sense pain. And they destroy their finger. You could be standing like this, you know, your finger in the fire burning off, and you don't even know it because you can't feel it. You could take a hammer and bash off your thumb and not feel it. So the first lesson to learn about suffering is that pain is God's way to keep us from self-destruction. And that's a moral lesson that you could explain most of the pain in the world by God's megaphone to keep us from self-destruction. Let me give you a good pain. You get a deep pain in your chest, good pain. You better go, you might be having a heart attack. Get one to your lower right side, good pain. You might need an appendectomy. Toothache, good pain. So pain is God's way to keep us from destroying ourselves.
Also in Philip Yancey's book, he talked about how the lepers circumvented the warning systems. They devised the warning systems to keep them from burning their hands off or they're knocking their fingers off. Tell them what they did and what the lepers did.
Yeah, it was like a little bleeper, you know, and every time they got near a fire, the bleeper would go on. They discovered it didn't work because you need more than the bleeper. It's like you don't wear seatbelts just because there's a bleeper on the dashboard. If you didn't put the seatbelt on and you got a shock, that would make you put the seatbelt on, right? So they found out that the bleeper system didn't work. Second lesson, not only does pain keep us from self-destruction, but it has to be strong enough to work. It has to be strong enough to work. It has to be a shock, not just a little bleeper. So then they hooked up a shock system on the leper. They get near fire, they got a shock. Didn't work twice. Worked only the first time, and then they were smart enough to say, hey, I'm going to turn this thing off next time I get fire because I don't want to get shocked. But final lesson, pain keeps us from self-destruction, has to be strong enough to work, and 3, it has to be out of our control. If we all controlled the rheostat of pain, we'd turn it all the way down every time. Even Rabbi Kushner's book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, said, I would never have chosen to go through this suffering with my son, and I can surely say that about my daughter, but I'm a better man for having done so, and we all are.
We're just starting on why does God permit physical suffering, and it's a very important topic, and it's something you're going to want to hear. We're going to pick it up next week, so I hope that you'll join us. Welcome. We have a terrific program for you today. My guest is Dr. Norman Geisler, philosopher, theologian, and we're talking about why does God allow suffering? How can physical evils like tornadoes and cancer be explained? And how can it be explained by free choice? And Norman, I was struck this week in the news. There was a girls' soccer team that was out playing. It was rather clear day, and out of nowhere in the sky, lightning came out of the sky. I don't think there were even clouds there. There were no warnings ahead of time. Boom, lightning came and killed some of the girls. We look at events like that. We've all got stories like that. But if there's a God who's all-powerful, who's in charge, who knows everything in advance, and a God who loves us, how can things like that happen? How do we fit this scenario of suffering, if you want to say almost needless suffering, suffering that is not attached to something that we did, that just comes to us, like tornadoes or hurricanes? We need to have the big picture, and we need your help, and we're glad that you're here to start us off.
Well, the big picture is that there's a good God. He made only good things. One of the good things he made was free will. Free will brought evil into the universe. Now the problem is you can explain moral evil by free will, but how do you explain physical evil by free will? I mean, who freely caused the hurricane or the tornado, or who freely caused the lightning to strike? How do we explain those physical evils? And the answer is, in brief, all physical evils are connected to free choice. And I can make it very simple in biblical terms. Adam sinned. That was a free choice. His sin had consequences on not only himself, but the whole human race. So the whole creation was put in bondage, Romans 8 says. Romans 5:12 says, by one man's sin entered the world, death by sin, death passed upon all men. So to make it very, very simple and biblical, all the physical evil in this universe resulted either directly or indirectly from free choice, and we can see a lot of it right from Adam's.
Yeah. Now, you know, some people just say, you're just wrong. I mean, how can free choice cause hurricanes, all right? Let's go through this list and let's slow this down and see if we can come to an understanding.
Well, the backdrop is this. God has to have a good purpose for everything, but we don't have to know that good purpose for there to be one. So even if I can't tell you a good purpose for every physical suffering in this world, there still is one, and no one can say there can't be one, because he'd have to be omniscient in order to say that no one, even God, has a good purpose. So let's suppose I'm a failure in the next few minutes, and I can't convince anyone that there are good purposes for physical evil. Does that prove God doesn't have one, or Geisler's dumb? See, just because I'm dumb doesn't mean God's dead. God can be alive and know things that I don't know, and the Bible tells us that he does. The secret things belong unto the Lord our God, and to us and to our children, the things that are revealed. But God hasn't left us in the dark. He's given us some knowledge, and we do know some good purposes for evil. We know purpose for a pain in the chest. We know a purpose for pain in the side. We know a purpose for pain in our tooth, so forth. We know the leprosy thing. Pain is to keep us from self-destruction. Now, I'll get into the particulars. How are these all connected with free choice? One, some evil we bring on ourselves. You smoke too much, you get cancer of the lung, you blame God? No. Some evils we bring on others. If I abuse my children, my free choice was used to bring evil on them. Some free evil is brought on others indirectly, not directly. If I am lazy and I find myself in poverty, then poverty is indirectly a result of laziness.
Yeah, let's slow it down for people. I loved your joke on some of the stuff that we cause directly, okay? And you had in your book that there was a man who read in his newspaper that conclusive evidence showed smoking was connected with lung cancer. And as a result, he canceled his subscription to the newspaper. What I'm saying is that, yeah, I think we need to slow this down for people, that some physical evil does come directly from our own free choices. We shouldn't blame God for that. We can see it. If we overeat and we get fat, can't say, hey, you know, God's got a problem here. All right? We made that choice, and he allowed us to make that choice. He allows us to make other choices, and some of them do cause us health problems. If we're A kind of personalities and we're flying all over the country and we're doing all kinds of things, We just had a friend that died recently because of his lifestyle, but he chose that. Well, you can't say, well, listen, God, somehow caused this thing. We bring these things on ourselves. So that's number one. Number two is some physical evils come to us indirectly. We don't choose it ourselves, but yeah, we might have parents. You had a dad who was an alcoholic, right?
Right.
So tell us a little bit about
Well,
what
I
happened to you.
grew up in poverty, and my parents used to fight. My father would get drunk and come home drunk, and the kids would be screaming and fighting. And so the consequences of his choices were found on us in terms of lack of proper food and clothes and so forth. And we do the same to other people by our decisions. Also, there are free choices that directly cause influence on others, and there are those that indirectly cause influence on others. Now, I would dare say if you took those four, directly on myself, directly on others, indirectly on myself, and indirectly on others, you could account for maybe 90% of all the physical evil in the universe. So what about the other 20%? Well, one.
Before you go there, tell me a little bit more of what you mean. I was thinking of something like, hey, there's a lot of people that have the freedom to drink, okay? So they kill a lot of people who weren't drinking just because they're driving drunk.
Right.
All right? That's one of those indirect things.
Exactly.
And again, it's not something that God did, but it's a result of giving all of us free choice. Now we're starting to harm each other. Give me another illustration along that line.
Well, we can all think of illustrations along that line. Somebody is aggressive in warfare, like take Saddam Hussein, and so he's killing off other people.
Torturing innocent
Hitler,
children.
torturing innocent children. You say, well, how can God allow innocent children to be tortured? God didn't torture them. An evil person called Saddam Hussein tortured those people. Or take the 3,000 people in the Trade Center building. They were innocent people. All they were was there that day, But some wicked terrorists caused that, and look at the indirect effect it had on our economy and people who are out of jobs and all the other things, the massive things, the network of things that come from just these evil actions.
Some people to me say, well, then I don't understand why God didn't stop it, okay? Well, if God stopped that, or those people, or Saddam Hussein, or the drunk from driving, it would sure cut into the rest of us in the things he would stop in our life. Okay, talk a little bit about that.
Well, if there were no consequences for actions, we'd never learn from our actions. If God stopped everything before we got the consequences, every time I pulled a trigger, if he turned the bullet into putty and there were no consequences for the action, then how would we learn? If you could jump off a cliff and not hit the bottom, or God could give you a soft landing, there's no consequence for your evil choice.
Well, I mean, I loved your illustration about parents and kids. If this actually worked there, talk about kids throwing knives and stuff.
Yeah, obviously, if you threw a knife at somebody else and it turned to putty every time and it didn't actually hurt, how would they learn it was wrong to throw knives? Or if you did anything, a word can hurt other people. If you never felt the consequence and no one else felt the hurt of words you use, how would we learn that it was wrong to speak like that? All of life is filled with free choices, have consequences. We learn that good consequences are a result of good choices, bad consequences are a result of bad choices. This is a moral world. We're moral creatures. It's a moral proving ground, and God is allowing us to exercise our freedom. Finally, your children would never grow up if you never gave them freedom. If we never allowed our kids to take the family car, they would never learn to drive. But every time we allowed them to do that, we took a risk that they could hit somebody else. And one time our daughter, did a glancing blow off a bus. But she would never have learned her freedom if we didn't give it to her. If we were just pulling the puppet strings, she would never grow up. So this is a universe in which God allows us to grow up by learning right from wrong, consequences for wrong action, good consequences for good action, and then he can achieve his higher moral good which is to make us more like himself. Back to the illustration of how do you purify gold? You turn the heat on, and the dross comes to the top, and then you scrape it off, and then the master can see his image in the molten gold. God is turning the heat on our life. Imperfections are surfacing. He can scrape them away. It's called sanctification in Christian terminology. And then he can see his image reflected in our life.
Okay, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about more reasons that will help us understand why God has decided to permit suffering, physical evils. And we're going to even talk about this thing of hurricanes and tornadoes. Why did God allow those, and how do those go back to free choice? I hope that you'll stick with us. We'll be right back. Welcome. We're back. We're talking with philosopher and theologian Dr. Norman Geisler about the problem of evil. God's reputation is on the line here. Why did he make the world the way it is? Why does he permit evil and suffering? There's got to be a good purpose. Christians are saying, yes, there is, and we're trying to talk about those purposes. And in talking about physical evils, we're not talking just about things that we decide to do ourselves, the moral consequences that we choose, but the fact is we're also talking about why do things come to us? For example, tornadoes and lightning and hurricanes and cancer. We didn't choose those. And Norm, give us the big picture again before we go on here. What is the big picture in terms of physical suffering and evil? Why does God permit this?
God permitted all evil to defeat all evil. He permitted all evil to bring a greater good in, and that's the ultimate justification. Why did he permit physical evil? Because physical evil is necessary in a moral universe to produce the moral good he's trying to produce. Pain is God's megaphone to arouse a morally deaf world. Pain keeps us from self-destruction. It has to be out of our control for it to be really effective. All of these things we learned from Philip Yancey's book, Where is God When It Hurts? But also there's some evil, physical evil, that cannot be accounted for by any direct or indirect act of free will. For example, a tornado, a hurricane. Those are byproducts. In other words, in a good world, you have to have a good physical world. You have to have air. You have to have winds. Well, you're going to get a tornado. Sooner or later, a tornado is going to spawn. You have to have water to drink and water to swim in and water to enjoy. Well, sooner or later, somebody's going to be drowned in that same water. These are byproducts of a good world. God purposed the good. There's a byproduct, what's called in war collateral damage. Well, you have collateral damage in a good universe. Where God has a good purpose to defeat evil, there's going to be collateral damage in this kind of universe as well.
Yeah, and that's a hard one for us to understand. We can understand it and not understand it at the same time. It's like parents who love their little kids when they're just learning to walk, okay, will allow that child to try to get up and bang their knee, and maybe worse. Why? Because if you kept them in a high chair the whole time, they would never learn to walk. So for the higher good of letting them learn to walk, you allow pain and suffering to happen. Talk about this thing of permitting and producing.
Well, we permit evil that we could produce a greater good. I permitted evil every time I let my kids take the family car, you know, because they could have crashed. But I was permitting basically their free choice. I was permitting their growth. I was permitting their ability to develop as individual human beings, and that's a greater good. The collateral damage that may or may not happen is part of the risk you take with freedom, both as a parent and that God took with the universe. In God's case, of course, he can rescue people by resurrecting them from the dead. I can't permit my kids to do it. So I can't watch my kid jump off a cliff, for example. But I can let them, when they're 16, take the family car. And they might get in an accident. God can allow people to jump off a cliff, because not only can he perform a miracle if he wanted to, he's going to resurrect all of us from the dead someday. So he can permit more evil to produce more good than we can. But the rule is the same, that we may permit as much evil to happen by free choice as we can reasonably control. So we let our little babies fall, but we don't let them take poison. God, on the other hand, can permit more because he knows more and can do more and can therefore rescue us from the ultimate fatality, which is death.
Throw a little bit more light on the biblical scenario of Adam choosing. And he made, as a free creature who was made perfect, he had the option, the freedom, to choose evil. And that had consequences, both for himself and for the environment. And Genesis comments on that. As you've mulled that over in your head, put a couple more things to that.
You can explain all of evil right there in Genesis 3. God said, you are free to take of every tree of the garden. So they were free. They made their choice, and God blamed them when they made their choice. But what happened? Sin, death, suffering, pain, all entered the world there. The creation was made subject to bondage. You could explain everything in the world right there as a result of that action. And we were all in Adam, according to Romans 5:12. We were all present in Adam. Well, we were there potentially. We were there probably legally, in the sense that he was our legal representative. And as a consequence, the legal and actual result of Adam's sin fell on the whole human race. Romans 5:12, by one man sin entered the world, death by sin, death passed upon all men. In Romans 8:29 and following, the whole creation was made subject to bondage. So there's the whole story, because you have an evil spirit, which brings in another factor. All of the rest of the evil in the universe can be accounted for by evil spirits, the devil and demons, making their free choice to inflict pain and evil and suffering on people like Job.
Yeah, let's finish up these, then we'll take some of the objections that people bring up to the very things we're talking about. Some physical suffering may be used by God as a warning about moral evils. In other words, it's a warning itself. Give me an example.
A warning pain is an example. Here's a physical pain that's warning you to avoid a greater physical pain. There might be a physical pain that's warning you to avoid a greater moral pain, where God might send some physical calamity, as he did in the Bible often, to warn people of greater judgment that's going to come if you don't repent.
Some evil may be permitted as a condition of a greater moral perfection. We don't like that one, but it's a real true. It's a real true point.
Tribulation works patience. There's no way to get to the promised land without going through the wilderness.
Yeah, I mean, you watch Monday Night Football, the athletes will tell you that, right?
No pain, no gain.
Yeah. Some physical evil occurs because higher forms live on lower ones. What does that mean?
The early bird gets the worm, and the early worm gets eaten.
But that doesn't seem like, in one sense it's true, in another sense it's just fair. What are you actually saying is behind that?
Well, you know, hey, even the vegetarians who want us not to eat any meat have to eat plants. Something's got to die that we can live. We live in a physical world where we have to take in energy. So the higher forms are going to live off the lower forms. It's for the greater good of the whole system that higher forms can live off of lower forms. So that what we call an evil to the lower form is part of a picture of greater good.
All right. Now what we're talking about is God has thought this whole thing through, and for the good of freedom has come up with a package, if you want, that has certain dangers with it. And let's take some of the objections to what we just brought out and let's answer them. Some people say, okay, if God is all loving and God's all powerful, all right, with some of these things that are happening, shoot, God could miraculously intervene and stop the lightning from coming out of the sky, stopping the tornado and the hurricane, stopping from your kid falling off the cliff. He could miraculously intervene. Why doesn't God just kind of do this on a 50-50 basis?
Because he can't do what's contradictory. He could stop, if he stopped the lightning, he would also be stopping the creation of nitric acid, because as the lightning goes through the oxygen and nitrogen, it combines into NO3, which is liquid fertilizer. And did you ever notice how your grass grows better after a thunder and lightning storm? Mm-hmm. So there are all of these things in the balance of nature. It's very easy for us as a finite being to criticize the plan. But you know, my answer to the atheist is, you try and make a better world. You come up, you design for me a world with all of its infinite intricacy that's better than this one. Design a better body than a human body, where all of the things have to be taken into consideration to make it work.
Yeah, I find science, which we hold in such high esteem, is based on the regularity of natural law, and what they're advocating is, listen, God intervened, do miraculous acts. You could just wipe out science at that point.
Sure, if every time, if you let's say, suspended the law of gravity in order to save someone miraculously from falling off a cliff, and then everybody in the world who was drinking water went up their nose and choked them all, and they died of choking. And you see the incredible amount of consequences that come once you start disrupting. Furthermore, if you disrupt nature regularly, then it's no longer a miracle, because what happens regularly is a natural law. You have to have a natural law as a basis for miracles. God does do miracles, but he does them only occasionally and rarely, because if they were done more regularly, one, we wouldn't learn anything from our actions because they would always be miraculously intercepted. Two, there wouldn't be a backdrop for the type of physical world in which we live, which is a necessary moral proving grounds. And three, it wouldn't be possible for the truly miraculous to happen, because that has to be a rare event.
Not only that, but then you'd have to have another God on top of God, because God would be caught in moral dilemmas in trying to choose who gets a miracle and who doesn't.
Yeah.
Explain that one.
Well, the same thing that we're always doing. You know, the farmer's praying for rain, and we're praying for no rain for a picnic. Which way is God can't do both. He can't do both. It's got to either rain or not rain. So since God can't do what is contradictory, since it's a moral proving ground, since it's a moral pain is a moral lesson to achieve his ultimate moral goal, if you consider all those factors, this is the best kind of world to produce the best world. Again, this is not the best of all possible worlds. It's the best of all possible ways to get to the best of all possible
Yeah, that's going to be our
worlds.
next program. People say, could God, I mean, surely God, with all of his power, with all his smarts, could have made a better world than the one we're living in. But you're saying this is the best possible way to get to that world, and we got to unpack all of that. But for the guy that is in physical suffering right now, or had an accident, or sweating with cancer, or whatever, what word of encouragement do you have to go to God and to trust him for the future?
First of all, there is a God there who knows everything, and he knows exactly why you're suffering. Secondly, it's only temporary. Thirdly, his own son came and went through suffering that's far worse than what you're going through for you, so that you don't have to suffer forever. That's really good news.
Could God have made a better world than the one that we're in? We're going to talk about that next program. I hope that you'll join us.